Good day, grade 12 learners. Welcome to today's Life Sciences lesson. My name is Dita Omagwala, and this program is brought to you by the Northern Cape Department of Education in collaboration with Pagama Research and Development. So today's lesson, we are looking at human reproduction. Human reproduction is a topic that is worth 41 marks out of 150 in both your prelim and your final examination. So it does have quite a lot of marks. So let's just get learning so that we can be able to grab as much of those marks as possible. So today we are going to be focusing on gametogenesis as well as the menstrual cycle. So with gametogenesis, we will be looking at both spermatogenesis as well as oogenesis, whereas with the menstrual cycle, we are only going to be looking at the part of the ovarian cycle. And then in the next lesson, we will then focus on the uterine cycle. So as I've said, we will be looking at gametogenesis. So here we'll be looking at the formation of gametes, which are our sex cells, which are the sperm cell and the ovum. So spermatogenesis, which would be the sperm cells, and then oogenesis, which would be the ovum, right? And then we're going to look at the structure of the sperm as well as that of the ovum, right? As well as their functions. Okay, and then with the menstrual cycle, as I've said, we're only going to focus on the ovarian cycle part, and then later on we will then focus on the uterine cycle. All right, so by the end of our lesson today, you should be able to describe the process of spermatogenesis. You should also be able to describe the process of oogenesis. You should be able to label and give functions of the parts of the sperm cell, as well as label and give functions of the parts of the ovum. And then you should be able to describe the ovarian cycle together with the role of the hormones that are involved in that cycle. And then you should also be able to interpret the graph of the menstrual cycle, which is what we will be looking at today. Right. So your pre-knowledge here would be meiosis as well as human reproduction from grade 9. So our understanding of meiosis will come in handy when we are looking at gametogenesis, and then with the human reproductive system would be with the menstrual cycle part. All right, let's have a look at our baseline activity for today. The first question says, how many cells are formed during meiosis? Right, so we know that during meiosis 4 cells are formed, as opposed to mitosis, which only forms 2 cells. Right, are the cells formed during meiosis haploid or diploid? The answer there would be haploid, right? And then number 3, name the type of cells formed during meiosis. So what kind of cells are formed here? The cells that are formed here are referred to as gametes. Number 4, name 2 female hormones secreted by the ovaries. So the hormones that are secreted by the ovaries would be estrogen and progesterone, which we spoke about in the previous lesson as well. And then what type of cell is produced in the ovaries? And that would be the ovum. All right, so those are our answers. Let's have a look at our terminologies before we move on to our lesson now. So the first one is gametogenesis, which is the process by which gametes are produced from the germinal epithelium of the male and the female sex organs. Secondly, we have spermatogenesis. So remember, gametogenesis would be the overall name for both spermatogenesis and oogenesis. So spermatogenesis would be the process by which spermatozoa are produced from the germinal epithelium of the testes, specifically in the males, whereas oogenesis would be the process during which the eggs or the ovum are produced from the germinal epithelium of the ovaries, which is in females. Next, we have testosterone, which is the male sex hormone produced by the testes. Gametes, those are that is the term for haploid sex cells. Right. Okay, fertilization, that is the fusing of the male sperm with the female ovum during intercourse. Menstrual cycle, that is the changes that occur in the ovary and the uterus of a female over a period of 28 days. Ovulation is a process during which the mature ovum is released from the Graafian follicle of an ovary, and endometrium, that is the lining of the uterus. And then the last terminology that we have is menstruation, which is the discharge of blood and other material from the lining of the uterus at intervals of about 1 month. Right. So as I have said that with gametogenesis, we are going to be looking at both the production of the sperm cell as well as the production of the ovum, which is going to take place in the testes of the male because those are the male sex organs, and in the ovaries of the female, which are the female sex organs. Right. So we have two types of gametogenesis, specifically spermatogenesis and oogenesis. Right. So we're going to look at the production of the ovum during oogenesis, and we're also going to look at the production of sperm cells during the spermatogenesis. So we're just going to have a look at what process takes place for these cells to be produced, for these two gametes to be produced, basically. Right. So we have looked at the structure of the testes, right? And we know that there is the germinal epithelium and the seminiferous tubules and so on. So those are the things that we're going to look at here just to see exactly what happens during this process, right? So as we know, this process will produce the spermatozoa from the germinal epithelium of the testes, which we looked at in the previous lesson. Right, so let's have a look at what happens, what exactly happens during this process. Right, so the cells of the germinal epithelium lining the seminiferous tubules. So we have the seminiferous tubules in the testes, and then we have this germinal epithelium, which lines this seminiferous tubules. Right, so those cells, these cells are diploid at this time. Right? Now, these cells are going to divide by meiosis. When cells divide by meiosis, we know that we are going to result in 4 cells that are haploid, right? So each cell divides to form 4 haploid cells. So however many cells are in the seminiferous tubules are going to divide by mitosis, and each of those cells are going to produce 4 new cells that are haploid, meaning that these 4 new cells are going to contain 23 chromosomes each, because we know that in humans have cells that have 46 chromosomes, right? Now, each of these haploid cells are called a spermatid. So now we're going to have a lot of spermatids that have been produced by mitosis. Right. Now these spermatids are then going to mature to form the spermatozoa. Right. As we can see here, we have the spermatogonium. Those are the cells that are lining the seminiferous tubules. And we can see that these are diploid, right? Meaning that they have 46 chromosomes. Now they are going to undergo meiosis. As they are undergoing meiosis, we would see that now at the end of meiosis, they are now haploid. And remember, each cell, this one cell that has undergone meiosis, has now produced 4 cells. And what do we call these cells? We call them the spermatids. And then those spermatids, those haploid spermatids are going to mature. And as they mature, they're now going to become sperm cells or spermatozoa. So that is how we're going to have the sperm cells. Now, one cell within the seminiferous tubules will produce 4 sperm cells. Now, if we have thousands of these cells, it means that thousands and thousands of sperm cells or spermatids are going to be produced, which is why we see that in males, a lot of sperm cells are produced at the same time, right? So now let's have a look at what these sperm cells or the spermatozoa that have been produced would then look like, right? So this sperm cell is mainly made up of 3 parts, which is the head, the middle piece, as well as the tail. So let's have a look at the tail. The head. There is our head, and the two main things that we are going to see here is the nucleus and the acrosome. We know what we find in the nucleus. We find DNA. So in this one, we are going to find the chromosomes. How many chromosomes? 23 chromosomes. Why? Because the sperm cell is a gamete and it is haploid because it was produced by meiosis, right? So 23 chromosomes are found within that nucleus, and then we have the acrosome. We're just going to look at the acrosome now and what it does, right? And then we have the middle piece. Mainly in the middle piece, we find the mitochondria. Remember, in the mitochondria, we also have mitochondrial DNA. Right, and remember, this mitochondrial DNA does not form part of the new zygote that has been formed because only the head enters the ovum during fertilization. And lastly, we have the tail. So let's just have a look at what these parts that we've just looked at, what roles they play in reproduction. All right, so the head is made up of the nucleus. That nucleus has 23 chromosomes, as we have said. 22 of those are autosomes. They are body chromosomes, whereas one can be a gonosome, and that gonosome can either be an X or a Y chromosome in males, because here we're looking at the sperm cell, so it can be an X or a Y. We have done this when we were doing genetics and genetics and inheritance. We know that males have either an X or a Y chromosome. And then the head also contains the acrosome, which is found right in front of the head. So it is the first thing that you find in front of the head. And this acrosome contains enzymes. Now, these enzymes play a big role in penetrating the ovum in such a way that they cause the breaking down of the outer layer of the ovum, in order for the sperm to be able to enter that ovum. So without the acrosome, the sperm cell will not be able to penetrate that ovum. Right. Then we have the middle piece, which is what we have right here. And the middle piece is mainly made up of the mitochondrion. Right. So it has a large number of the mitochondria, which provides energy for the sperm cell, right? So that the sperm cell can be able to move. So this is mainly for movement of the sperm cell, so that the sperm cell can be able to swim towards the ovum, right? As soon as it enters the female body. Right. And then lastly, we have the tail, which is long and is also used for swimming. So it allows for the sperm cell to be able to swim towards the ovum. So remember, we have one ovum and thousands of sperm cells, meaning that the one with the best mitochondria that gives it as a lot of energy is the one that will be able to swim faster and reach that ovum quicker. Right. Then we have oogenesis, which is the production of the ovum in the germinal epithelium as well. So this is a process during which the germinal epithelium of the ovary give rise to an ovum. Right. So let's have a look at that process as well. So the germinal epithelium of the ovaries produces a large number of follicles. So now we are looking at the production of follicles. Right. Now, these follicles are actually produced by mitosis. What does this tell us about these follicles? These follicles are going to be diploid, and these follicles, meaning that they are going to contain 46 chromosomes, right? So we have many follicles. These follicles are produced by mitosis. The follicles are diploid, right? Now, a single cell inside the follicle will enlarge. Right. Now, we have a lot of follicles. Single cells within the follicles are going to enlarge, and then that enlarged cell is the one that's actually going to undergo meiosis. Remember, all gametes have to be haploid, so meiosis still needs to take place. So the enlarged cell is then going to undergo meiosis. We know that as soon as we talk about meiosis, we are now talking about a haploid cell. So 4 haploid cells are then going to result from that process of meiosis. Then only one of these cells is going to survive, meaning that the rest are not going to survive. As we can see here, only one has survived to become an ovum. This is why females only produce one ovum per month or per cycle, right? However, we do know that sometimes some females will produce more than one ovum, and that would usually lead to them having twins, right? So however, normally all of these other ones will not survive, and only one will survive, and that is the only one that will then be able to develop into a mature ovum. So we start here. We have that diploid oogonium, as we can see here. It undergoes meiosis, and then it produces 4 haploid cells. Of these 4 haploid cells, the other 3 do not survive, and only one survives, and it is the only one that then becomes an ovum. Right, so let's have a look at the structure of the ovum over here. On the center, it contains a nucleus. It also contains the cytoplasm. So because it has been produced by meiosis, it means that it contains 23 chromosomes, just like the sperm cell, which is why at the end of the day, during fertilization, it is going to be 23 chromosomes from the ovum and 23 chromosomes from the sperm cell, giving us 46 chromosomes. And then we have the first polar body over there, and then we have the jelly-like layer or the jelly coat, which is also referred to as the zona pellucida. And then we have the corona radiata as well. So that would be our structure of the ovum, right? Ovum is produced by oogenesis, sperm cell is produced by spermatogenesis. And remember, both these processes involve meiosis so that the sperm cell and the ovum can be haploid. Right, now let's have a look at this first activity that we have over here. It says exercise and sperm count. Research was conducted to determine the effect of lifestyle on the sperm count of young males. In this study, 189 young male students from a university in New York filled out questionnaires on their physical activity, diet, stress, and other lifestyle factors. Each male then provided a semen sample. The results showed that the male students who exercised for more than 15 hours a week had a sperm count of 73%. So 15 times a week and a sperm count of 73% higher than those who exercised fewer than 5 hours a week. Right. A second investigation showed that men who watched more than 20 hours of TV per week instead of exercising had 44% lower sperm count than men who watched little to no TV. A person who exercises secretes more antioxidant enzymes that can prevent a natural process called oxidative stress from damaging cell membranes in the body. This damage can disrupt the formation of new sperm. When watching TV or sitting, the scrotum gets pushed against their body, making the region of their testes hotter and possibly preventing new sperm from being produced. All right, now let's have a look at the first question here. It says it's 6.1. It says name the specific meiotic process responsible for the production of sperm cells. So we know that the meiotic process that is responsible for the production of sperm cells is spermatogenesis. All right, and then 6.2, explain why a high temperature in the region of the testes may prevent the production of new sperm. Right, so we know that the body temperature is about 37 degrees and the scrotum is placed outside of the male body so that the temperature of the testes is lower than the body temperature. This is so that the enzymes involved in spermatogenesis are not damaged by the high temperatures, right? So those enzymes function at an optimum temperature just below 37 degrees Celsius. So if it is around 37 or more, it means that those enzymes will not be able to function, meaning that their enzyme activity has been reduced, and that can affect the ability of the testes to produce any sperm. So higher temperature will denature the enzymes and damage the cell membranes. All right. 6.3, state a general conclusion that can be drawn from the results in the first investigation. So let's have a look at the first investigation. The first investigation was that more exercise led to the males having higher sperm count, right? All right, so let's have a look at that. An increase in exercise increases sperm count. So it means that males are encouraged to exercise more in order to have high chances of increasing their sperm count. 6.4, it says state one way in which the reliability of this investigation could be increased. We know that whenever we talk about reliability, we are going to talk about two things. We are going to talk about repeating that investigation or increasing the sample size. Now let's go back. It says here, 189 young male students were used. It means that we can use more students, we can increase the sample size, or we can then redo the experiment. Then we can say that we can increase the experiment to get that. So increase the number of participants, which is the sample size, or repeat the investigation. Right, so it said one, but you can give any of those two. You don't have to give both. Right, last question for activity 1, 6.5. Draw a labeled diagram to show the structure of a male sperm cell. So you should be able to draw the male sperm cell as well as the female's ovum, as well as to give labels for those, right? And you should also be able to give functions for each of those parts. So here we have the sperm cell. First thing, you must have a heading or a caption for every drawing. So there is the caption for our drawing. It says sperm cell. That's it. By simply saying that, you are going to get a mark. Heading, 1 mark. I mean, that is a free mark. So make sure you always give that heading. Right. Next, you have correct drawing. They said draw a sperm cell. Is your drawing a sperm cell? Before we even look at the labels, is it a sperm cell? If yes, then you get another mark. Right. Then the next 2 marks, any 2 correct labels. Sometimes it could be 5 marks. It means that you would then be expected to give 3 or more labels. Now, give all the labels and then you will see which mark you get. Don't say, okay, if it's 4 marks, it means 1 mark is for the heading, 1 mark is for the correct drawing, and I'm only going to give 2 labels. Give all of the labels and then you will get all your marks. So we have the acrosome, the nucleus, the mitochondrion, and then we have the tail. So you can also indicate that this is the head and this is the middle piece. And then you will be able to score your full 4 marks, which is quite easy marks to get. All right. Next question, it says diagrams 1 and 2 below represent gametogenesis in human males. So already we know that if it's in human males, we're talking about spermatogenesis, and females, not in any particular sequence. The diagrams are not drawn to scale. All right. Now we have diagram 1 and we have diagram 2. Now, if we look at diagram 1 and diagram 2, from what we just learned, you should be able to identify which one represents spermatogenesis and which one represents oogenesis. As we can see here, these cells have degenerated, right? It means that those are the cells that did not survive after meiosis, and only one cell survived, which tells us that this is oogenesis. Whereas in the male spermatogenesis, all of the cells are going to survive and form those spermatids. Right. Identify the specific type of gametogenesis in diagram 1, which I've just already mentioned. That would be oogenesis. Right. All right. Explain your answer to 5.1 by referring to a visible difference between diagram 1 and diagram 2. As I have said, in diagram 1, we can see that only one cell survives, whereas in diagram 2, all of the cells survive. This tells us that this is the spermatogenesis process, whereas here we have the oogenesis process, whereby only one ovum is going to be produced. So it says here at the end of the process in diagram 1, which is oogenesis, one gamete is formed or one ovum forms, whereas the 3 cells degenerate. Or you can say that at the end of the process in diagram 2, which is spermatogenesis, 4 gametes or sperm cells are formed and none of them have degenerated. Okay, and then we have 5.3. Where in the body does the type of gametogenesis shown in diagram 2 take place? Gametogenesis in diagram 2 is spermatogenesis, and spermatogenesis takes place in the testes or in the seminiferous tubules. Okay, 5.4, give the number of chromosomes or the chromosome number of the cells at 1 and the cell at 2. Let's go back. The cells at 1 is here or here, which is the same. This is at the end of meiosis 1, right? At the end of meiosis 1, remember you started off with 46 chromosomes here, at the end of meiosis 1, you are going to, this is the part where the halving of chromosomes takes place. You're going to have 23, 23, also here 23, 23, right? Does the chromosome number halve again after meiosis 1? Do we have the halving effect again at the end of meiosis 2? No. Remember here, it's because the chromatids split instead of whole chromosomes splitting. So even at 2, we are going to have 23 chromosomes, just as we would have 23 chromosomes at 3 as well. However, the question was asking about 1 and 2. So our answer for both would be 23 chromosomes here and 23 chromosomes at cell 2, right? Okay, let's go back to 5.5. Name 2 processes that take place during meiosis 1 that lead to genetic variation in the 4 cells shown at diagram 3. So all the cells that are shown at diagram 3 here, they are going to be genetically different from each other. Any cell that is produced by meiosis is going to be genetically different from the other cells. So what processes take place to make sure that these cells are genetically different from each other? It's the fact that during prophase 1, we experience crossing over, right? So here we are going to have crossing over, whereas during metaphase, the chromosomes are going to align at the equator randomly. So whole chromosomes will align randomly at the equator, which would then make sure that the chromosomes are going to separate in that manner when they are going to be pulled to the opposite poles during anaphase. Right, so crossing over and random arrangement of chromosomes. The fact that the chromosomes are randomly arranged is the main thing there. 5.6, it says, explain the implication for the human population size if the 3 cells referred to in diagram 1 did not degenerate but remained as gametes. So now, let's imagine that a female produced 4 ova every cycle. Now, because males produce thousands of sperm cells every time, it would mean that these thousands of sperm cells would now have a chance to fertilize 4 ova during intercourse, meaning that every time a female conceives or falls pregnant, it would mean that they would carry 4 babies, right? So we were going to have 4 zygotes that were being produced, and they would develop into human beings. So it would mean that the population size would have increased so much. We would have a high population. Actually, it would triple, right? So the population size would increase a lot. So this will result in multiple births. There will be increased chances of fertilization, which will lead to an increase in the human population. All right, so now let's move on to the menstrual cycle. So remember here we are looking at the changes that occur in the ovary and in the uterus of a female over a period of 28 days. Now, the changes that occur in the ovary include what we just looked at now, which is oogenesis, right? And then we are also going to look at the changes that occur in the uterus. However, we will look at that in the next lesson. Please note that whatever changes happen in the ovary and the changes that happen in the uterus can overlap, meaning that some of them can take place at the same time. However, I just decided that we would split this so that you can have a proper understanding of what happens in the uterus and a proper understanding of what happens in the ovary, so that it does not get overwhelming and confusing. However, at the end of the lesson, you should be able to understand that all of these things happen at the same time. You would see that even when we look at what happens on day 1, what happens on day 14, what happens on day 28, we are going to be looking at what happens at both in both the ovaries and the uterus. So let it not be confusing, but just be aware that these 2 processes can happen at the same time. So we have 2 cycles, which is the ovarian cycle and the uterine cycle. Today we will focus on the ovarian cycle, meaning that we will look at what happens in the ovaries. Right. Now, The ovarian cycle would describe the changes that occur in the ovaries during the development of the ovum within the Graafian follicle. So we are going to look at all of that. We're going to look at what happens from step 1 over here until step 6. So basically, we are going to look at what happens during this production of the ovum. Remember, we were just looking at ovulation now. So, I mean, not ovulation, but oogenesis. So we're going to look at what happens when the ovum is being produced, and then until this ovum is actually available to be fertilized by the sperm cell. Right. So the ovarian cycle is controlled by 2 hormones. Those hormones are the follicle stimulating hormone, which we also refer to as FSH, and the luteinizing hormone. We are going to look at what these 2 hormones do in the ovaries, or what it does for the ovarian cycle. So we are going to look at the functions of these 2 hormones, and as we are looking at that, we are going to actually get a better understanding of this whole cycle. Right. So the follicle stimulating hormone, as I've said, it's also known as FSH. Now, these hormones, some of them have a direct meaning to what they do. It says it is a follicle stimulating hormone. When we looked at oogenesis, there was the part that spoke about the follicles being produced, right? The cells of the germinal epithelium produce numerous follicles. Then this follicle stimulating hormone is going to stimulate the development of the follicle stimulating hormone, follicle stimulating hormone. So it's a hormone that stimulates the follicles. Now, this FSH is produced by the hypophysis or the pituitary gland. Now, the pituitary gland is in the brain. Now we are talking about the ovaries. So remember, this FSH would then be an endocrine hormone, meaning that it is a hormone that is released from the brain and then into the bloodstream so that it can travel to the target organ, which is the ovary. So it's released here into the bloodstream, and then it travels to the ovaries, where it is going to stimulate those follicles. Right. So this is what is happening there. We are going to look at what happens as the follicle develops until it is released so that it can be fertilized by the sperm cell. Remember, this ovum needs to go into the fallopian tube where it will meet the sperm cell. So we're going to look at the steps that happen until that takes place. Now, this FSH is responsible for the development of the Graafian follicle. So this follicle starts as a primary follicle, and then as it develops with the release of the FSH, it's going to develop into a Graafian follicle. Right. So the germinal epithelium, as we've said in the previous part of oogenesis, will give rise to the follicles, numerous follicles. Remember? And then one of those follicles, only one, will develop into a large follicle, and that large follicle is called a Graafian follicle. Then this means that that one large follicle that becomes the Graafian follicle is the one that will then undergo meiosis and become that ovum now. Right? The ovum is found within the Graafian follicle. So within the Graafian follicle, that is where we are going to find that ovum that was produced by meiosis. So let's just have a look at that. So we have numerous follicles that were produced by the germinal epithelium, right? And then it is going to develop through the stimulation of FSH. It is going to develop into a Graafian follicle. As the Graafian follicle develops, you would see that within that Graafian follicle, we have an ovum, as we can see over here. We have an ovum as the Graafian follicle develops. Remember, this Graafian follicle is developing due to the functioning of the FSH hormone. As the FSH hormone is being secreted by the pituitary gland, it causes the Graafian follicle to develop, and the ovum that is within that Graafian follicle. Now, this Graafian follicle also plays a role in the whole cycle. It secretes the hormone estrogen, which we spoke about previously as well. So it's going to secrete the hormone estrogen. Now, What is this estrogen important for? Why is the estrogen being released now? Estrogen is involved in the preparation of the uterus for pregnancy. We know the function of the uterus. We know that the uterus is the part of the female's reproductive system that holds and protects that developing embryo during pregnancy, right? So it prepares the uterus for that pregnancy, so that it can hold implantation of the embryo and for pregnancy to be successful, basically. So because the Graafian follicle is carrying an ovum and the ovum is going to be released, it means that as the ovum is being released and fertilization could take place, preparations for the fertilized ovum, which is a zygote, should then be done, which is done by the estrogen that is going to prepare the uterus. So that should fertilization take place, the uterus is ready to receive that zygote. Right. So how does it prepare the uterus? How does estrogen prepare the uterus? It makes the uterus thicker. So the thicker the uterus, the easier the chance of attachment, right? How else? It increases the blood supply. We know that the supply of blood vessels, we know that blood provides us with a lot of things. It's going to provide the nutrients, it's going to provide oxygen and all of that. So the supply of blood vessels will increase so that the supply of blood that is carrying all the nutrients and the oxygen to be higher, right? And then it also makes it more glandular. So it is going to be more glandular as well, right? Now, this is something that is going to be taking place around the first few days of the cycle, which is what we are seeing over here, right? We can see the ovum there. We can see the Graafian follicle developing more and more, and then with the ovum there. And then when we reach day 14, so day 1 is the first day of the cycle, right? In the uterus. First day, the follicle is developing into a Graafian follicle, and on day 14, the Graafian follicle is going to rupture. When it ruptures, it's going to open up. As we can see, it has ruptured here. When it ruptures, what happens? It releases that ovum. So it's going to release the ovum into the fallopian tubes. When it releases this ovum into the fallopian tubes, we call that process ovulation. The release of the ovum is called ovulation. So now it means that because ovulation has taken place, it means that the ovum is available to be fertilized. Right? So this is the process during which a mature ovum is released from the Graafian follicle into the fallopian tube for fertilization. The funnels of fallopian tubes will collect this ovum, and the ruptured Graafian follicle will now become what we call a corpus luteum. Let's have a look at that. So we started off with the follicles. They developed into a Graafian follicle, which contains an ovum, and then that mature Graafian follicle ruptures. As it ruptures, it releases the ovum. Ovulation has taken place. Now we have what? An empty Graafian follicle. This empty Graafian follicle is going to be converted into a corpus luteum. The ruptured Graafian follicle becomes a corpus luteum. Empty Graafian follicle becomes a corpus luteum. Now, when this conversion of the Graafian follicle into a corpus luteum occurs, it occurs due to the function of a hormone called the luteinizing hormone. So because the luteinizing hormone causes ovulation as well, it is going to cause ovulation, rupturing of the Graafian follicle, and then cause that ruptured Graafian follicle to now become a corpus luteum, as we can see over here. So the conversion of the ruptured Graafian follicle into a corpus luteum is controlled by the luteinizing hormone. Okay, so those are the two hormones that we mentioned, and we are now looking at their functions. This hormone is also produced by the pituitary gland. So the two pituitary gland hormones are functioning to develop follicle into a Graafian follicle that contains an ovum, and then the release of the ovum, which is ovulation, is stimulated by the luteinizing hormone, and the conversion of the Graafian follicle into a corpus luteum. Now, this corpus luteum also plays a role now. It plays a role in secreting the hormone progesterone, which we are going to look at just now. So let's just, again, I just want us to have a look at this whole setup here and get a better understanding of what happens. Follicles here, these follicles are developing. We can see they're growing. As they're growing, they contain an ovum on the inside. This is now what we call the Graafian follicle here. And then the ovum, Graafian follicle ruptures. It releases the ovum, which is ovulation. And then this Graafian follicle is now empty. What does it become? It becomes a corpus luteum. What causes the Graafian follicle to become a corpus luteum is the luteinizing hormone, which is also called LH, right? And then the corpus luteum is not just any useless part that we find here. It's going to release a hormone. Which hormone is this? It's going to release progesterone. Okay, now we're going to look at why do we need this progesterone? Progesterone is responsible for maintaining pregnancy. So remember, an ovum has been produced or released, meaning this ovum can be fertilized at any time. Now, pregnancy could occur. If this pregnancy occurs, it needs to be maintained, right? It needs to carry on for the full gestation period or for the full 9 months. Therefore, it is going to be maintained by the functioning of the progesterone hormone. However, fertilization might not occur. If fertilization does not occur, the corpus luteum is going to break down. If the corpus luteum does not breaks down, it means that it will stop producing progesterone. However, we do not need progesterone because there's no pregnancy to maintain, right? So the progesterone is no longer secreted, and the unfertilized ovum then is released from the body through menstruation, whereby blood is going to leave the body together with that unfertilized ovum, right? So let's just have a look at that again. Pituitary gland in the brain releases LH and FSH. What does the FSH do? The FSH stimulates the development of the follicle, right? As it stimulates the development of the follicle, which you are seeing here, it develops into a Graafian follicle. Then pituitary gland releases LH, luteinizing hormone, so that it can stimulate ovulation. As it stimulates ovulation, it also stimulates the conversion of the empty Graafian follicle into a corpus luteum. What does the corpus luteum do? The corpus luteum is going to secrete progesterone. Remember, the Graafian follicle would have already released estrogen. When it releases the estrogen, is to prepare the uterus for pregnancy, should that released ovum be fertilized. Now, if the released ovum is fertilized, we need pregnancy to be maintained. Is there anything in place to make sure pregnancy is maintained? Yes, the corpus luteum is going to release the hormone progesterone, which will then maintain pregnancy. So the Graafian follicle here releases estrogen. The corpus luteum here releases progesterone. It also releases some estrogen. This estrogen and this progesterone is going to work on the uterus, the lining of the uterus, to make sure that the uterus is prepared for pregnancy, is prepared to maintain the pregnancy throughout that 9 months of pregnancy. Okay, let's have a look at our first question, 2.2.1. Name the pituitary hormone which shows a sharp increase just before the 14th day of the menstrual cycle. Now, it says pituitary hormone. That is a great guide. So you know that it can either be the luteinizing hormone or FSH. Now, we know that FSH will increase during the first few days as it stimulates the development of the follicle, right? So it cannot be FSH. It means that it is going to be the luteinizing hormone, because we know that it is actually going to stimulate ovulation, which happens on day 14. So it means that the hormone that is going to increase around day 14 will be the luteinizing hormone. Right. Now, the second question, 2.2.2, describe the functions of the hormone mentioned in 2.2.1. Right. We know that it stimulates ovulation or the release of the ovum, and it also converts that empty Graafian follicle or that ruptured Graafian follicle into a corpus luteum. So it causes ovulation, releasing the ovum from the Graafian follicle, or it causes the formation of the corpus luteum, or it converts the Graafian follicle into a corpus luteum. 2.2.3, name the hormone that causes the endometrium to start thickening from day 7 and state one other function of this hormone. So remember, as the Graafian follicle develops, it releases the hormone estrogen. And what does this estrogen do? It prepares the endometrium for pregnancy, right? So that is what this hormone estrogen would then do, right? They said one other function of estrogen, it stimulates the production of the luteinizing hormone, and it is responsible for the development of the female secondary characteristics. We spoke about this in the previous lesson, right? And then 2.2.4, it says name 2 ovarian hormones and state their origin. So the 2 ovarian hormones that we can talk about here can be estrogen and progesterone. Now, where do these come from? So remember, the Graafian follicle will secrete the estrogen hormone, right? Whereas the progesterone hormone is secreted by the corpus luteum in order to maintain pregnancy, right? Now, let's have a look at our last activity for today. It says the diagram below shows some of the changes that take place during the menstrual cycle. So we can see from day 1 until day 28. Day 14, we can see ovulation taking place there, and then we have our corpus luteum, and here we are having the development of the follicle, and we have the Graafian follicle over there. Right. Now, 18.1 says the menstrual cycle is controlled by hormones. Name one hormone which will increase in level between day 2 and day 10. Right. So we know that during day 2 and day 10, or between those days, we are looking at FSH. We are looking at the development of the follicle. Therefore, the follicle stimulating hormone will increase. Also, as the follicle, the Graafian follicle is developing, it starts to release the hormone estrogen. So the hormone estrogen will also increase around those days. So between day 2 and day 10, the estrogen hormone would also have increased. 18.2, it says give one observable reason for your answer to question 18.1. Right. So remember, when they are talking about observable reasons, you need to be able to give reasons that you can see from what you are given. Right. So we can see that the follicle is developing during this period. We can see here that there is that development of the follicle, and this is because of an increase in FSH. Right. Another thing, the estrogen hormone. Remember, the estrogen hormone prepares the lining of the uterus. How do you see that the lining of the uterus is being prepared? It will start to thicken. As we can see here, it is thickening. So that thickening is due to the estrogen hormone. So those are the 2 observable reasons why we are saying that these 2 hormones are increasing during that day 2 to day 10 period. So the follicle will develop during this period, stimulated by increased levels of FSH, right? And the lining of the endometrium will thicken during this period, and it is stimulated by the increased levels of estrogen. 18.3, explain evidence from the diagram which indicates that fertilization took place. Now, if fertilization has taken place, you would see that the corpus luteum will not degenerate, right? It will remain because it must continue secreting progesterone. Because remember, we spoke about that if fertilization does not take place, the corpus luteum will degenerate or disintegrate, right? Also, which is something that we are only going to focus a bit more on in the next lesson when we look at the uterine cycle, is that the lining of the uterus has remained thick. If the lining of the uterus does not remain thick, if it starts to shed like what we are seeing around day 1 here, you would see that means that menstruation is taking place and the thickening is being removed. Therefore, it is an indication that fertilization did not take place. Remember, if fertilization did not take place in a female, menstruation will then take place. We are going to also look at that a bit more in the next lesson. So the corpus luteum, as I've said, has not disintegrated. We still have the corpus luteum. That is a sign that fertilization indeed has taken place. It continues to secrete progesterone. Also, the endometrium lining has remained thickened, which is what we are seeing over there. 18.4 says, describe the developmental changes in the fertilized ovum until implantation occurs in the uterus. So this is a question that will mainly be looked at in the next lesson, whereby we are looking at the development. I'm just going to mention what happens, but we are still going to learn about this a bit more in our next lesson, so do not worry. So what would happen there is that after fertilization, we have that diploid zygote. This diploid zygote will start to divide by mitosis in order to multiply the cells. Remember, mitosis produces diploid cells that are genetically identical. So those will undergo mitosis to form what we call a ball of cells. This ball of cells is called the morula, which will continue to divide by mitosis again, and it will now form a hollow ball of cells or a hollow cavity. This hollow cavity is called the blastocyst or the blastula. Right, and then the outer membrane of that blastocyst will form what we call a chorionic villi, which will attach to the body and the endometrium of the female. So that is what would happen between fertilization and implantation or attachment on the uterus. Like I said, we will look at this in a bit more details in the next lesson, whereby you're also going to get visual understanding of what really happens. So do not worry if it does not make a lot of sense now. The last question, 18.5, it says some females use an ovulation monitor so that they can be aware of the days when they are fertile. These monitors measure the level of hormones in the blood, right? So obviously, by understanding the levels of hormones in the blood, you are able to understand when ovulation will take place and so on. For example, we just looked at the luteinizing hormone levels, FSH levels, and the estrogen levels in the previous question. And we know that as the luteinizing hormone levels are increasing, it means that ovulation will take place. So we know that if ovulation is taking place, those would be the right times to try and conceive, because we know that the ovum is definitely available for fertilization. Question says, why would females want to know when they are fertile? This can be whether you want to be able to conceive or you want to avoid falling pregnant. So females can do this for those two reasons, right? So it's basically for family planning, to know when they can get pregnant or to know when they cannot get pregnant. All right. And then the second part of that question, it says, explain which hormone is likely to be monitored by the ovulation monitor. Right. We can monitor the estrogen hormone. We can monitor the FSH. We can also monitor the LH. We do not need to monitor progesterone, because progesterone is going to be monitored after fertilization has taken place, because it maintains pregnancy. Now, the estrogen hormone is around day 10. So you know that it means you are on day 10 if the estrogen hormone is starting to increase, right? And then the FSH hormone is in preparation for the follicle. So as it increases together with the luteinizing hormone, you know that which day of the cycle are you exactly. There is a rise in the levels of LH, FSH, and estrogen around the time of ovulation. So you know that the ovum is available. Therefore, if you want to conceive, you can then try to conceive around that time. Okay, here we have homework. Have a look at the graph. Have a look at the hormones that are involved here, and then have a go at the questions, which will then be discussed in the next lesson. All right, let's just quickly summarize what we did today. We did gametogenesis, spermatogenesis, and oogenesis. Spermatogenesis takes place in the testes. It produces 4 mature sperm cells, all of them which have survived, right? And then this takes place around puberty, and then also the sperm cell may contain the X chromosome or the Y chromosome, right? And then it has a flagella to move, it has the acrosome to penetrate the ovum, and it contains 23 chromosomes. Remember, it is going to be, though all these sperm cells are going to be haploid because they are produced by mitosis. In females, it takes place in the ovaries, only one mature ovum. The other ones are going to break down, or they're going to disintegrate, the other three, right? And then the ovum is larger than the sperm cell, and it can only contain the X chromosome, which is produced by the female, whereas the male Y chromosome will produce a male child and the X will produce a female child. Now, here on the ovarian cycle, we will focus only on the ovary. We know that around day 1 to day 5, that is menstruation, if fertilization did not take place in the previous cycle, right? From day 6 to 13, the follicles are developing now. The development of the follicle until we have a Graafian follicle that is developing with the ovum inside. And then on day 14, the follicle bursts and releases that ovum into the fallopian tubes for fertilization. As the Graafian follicle bursts or opens up, it is going to be converted by the luteinizing hormone into a corpus luteum. The corpus luteum will then secrete the hormone progesterone in order to maintain pregnancy should fertilization take place. All right, in our next lesson, we are going to be looking at the uterine cycle. As we have said, we're going to look at fertilization, implantation, as well as gestation. Okay, we have come to the end of our lesson for today. Thank you for watching. I will see you next time. Goodbye.